So Thomas gave me the kind permission to repeat the words that we heard from Andrea yesterday, which is, "This is my show." So I'm allowed to ask a lot of questions, and hopefully a productive dialogue will emerge. And I think there's three main subject matters that I would like to explore, and then we can see the directions that it goes from there. Because I know that you, in your work, you seem to be converging very nicely with, for instance, the work of an individual like John Vervaeke, who you've befriended, I think, also over the years. And both of you seem to be interested in how do we get this dialogical space, maybe also, let's say, the spirit that we find in this festival here, and we can maybe talk about what that might mean. How do we house that not just here, but maybe, as John Vervaeke also mentioned at the previous conference, as maybe a nexus point for society. So I'm curious. Some of the problems you mentioned is that, and you mentioned this in your talk yesterday, is that there seems to be a huge resistance from society in looking at the sacred from their own presuppositions of scientific rationalism. And it would be interesting to see maybe what does an individual like John Vervaeke, and how, to what extent do you align yourself, to what extent do you differ in his attempts to expand our notions of rationality. So I'm curious to look at the sacred and rationality, and then also maybe to move the conversation towards, okay, and what do we do with that in this little corner overall, but also in this festival here in Mannheim? How do we properly respond to that? So maybe you can start a little bit about maybe your relation to John's work and your thoughts.
John has I really can talk very deep today.
It's a proper festival, all right. We went crazy last night.
Throat singing today. Very welcome. Thank you for the question. John has a very nice word in relationship to that I find very meaningful. When the topic comes up about rationality and the expansion of, he always brings in what he coins ratio religio, which is basically going back to the roots of the Latin roots, what ratio and religio means. And the way I would interpret it is the right relatedness to reality in the end. So it's rationality is not kind of logic in the sense of calculative logic to what we have it reduced since Descartes. Not only him, but he's kind of the poster boy for it. But it's a deeper sense of right relatedness to reality, which also presupposes that there is something like reality, yes. Which is in postmodern time not necessarily a given to think. If I may expand a little bit with a story from yesterday, we had a very nice dinner in the restaurant, and it was so noisy there. It was hard to have any kind of conversation. But Matthias and I tried anyway. So
we can hear you tried anyway. So
yeah.
Yes.
We did what everyone else did, which helped the situation. We screamed to each other, and I really used the time, because we were sitting next to each other, to ask him, so what are you really doing? I don't understand. And he kind of explained and gave me big examples, and I asked. It was a back and forth, and at some point I kind of something came to me as a sentence that I gave to him. Oh, what you're doing is spiritual homing. And he had a very positive response to that. And that's also my understanding of the estuary process, what you're doing. I shortly talked with Paul about this this morning. It seems also to resonate with him that this is not about a church per se, but it's about homing. And let's talk about homing. Ratio really has to do with homing, and spiritual that has to do with a certain dimension of transcendence. So rationality in the Vavikian sense has to do with that.
Thank you very much. It's I know it's very appropriate that you mentioned it. The title of one of the previous conferences was "The Quest for a Spiritual Home," and it seems that the focus on this one with the peoples and paths and places, and specifically that last word, is indeed trying to maybe, let's say, land the plane a little bit on this one. So I think all of us can reflect in some ways that the questing is still happening, but we also find an increased need to home that much more. So it's like we're moving on to the second part of that sentence. And it would also need, I think what you mentioned about the whole Cartesian understanding of rationality, it does seem like the ratio religio that Vervaeke brings up, it's specifically indeed the proportioning oneself, and that's the ratio aspect, that's the virtuosity aspect that Vervaeke becomes interested in. And I'm curious because we're building a home here, or at least that's you mentioned this, and there seems to be a positive response, and I hope that people here experience it that way. And is that a home safe from outside society, or is that an open home that welcomes individuals from society? How do you experience being here as a little bit more of an outsider compared to the people here?
That's an interesting question, because obviously it's both, and I think obviously it has to be both, because part of what our meaning crisis is about is the lack of home. So when you attempt to create home, you have to go somewhere where culture is not. In the culture that kind of, if we stay in the paradigm, somehow lost home. And then is the question, how do we do that? And one aspect that I would like to emphasize is very simply coming together, and coming together in a deeper sense that you usually think the word. And I have a very interesting ongoing discussion with John, because he is deeply a Neoplatonist, you know that. And I'm deeply Heideggerian, and Heidegger doesn't like Plato, so that's a great. That's a very.
Heidegger also read Nietzsche, so that helps.
Yeah. So it's a very productive opponent processing that we have there. But to use John's background here, coming together or any kind of homing. It means that becoming one in the end. That reality is not kind of broken up into pieces. It's not a denial of plurality, but it makes the point, and you can say this is a Neo-Platonist point, that everything in the end comes together in the one. And when we really come home, we really come to the one. That's, of course, already a spiritual claim.
Right. Well, can you maybe? I'm curious about you personally that then too, because you have this then contrasting vision to John in some ways. So what have been the wisdom traditions of your background that have helped you to orient in this space? And to contrast that with a second point, you mentioned in your talk yesterday that you've recently gotten interested in, for instance, Islam, and for instance, the Shinto tradition as well. So can you speak a little bit more on, is that something you're moving towards? Is it something you're briefly exploring? And if so, for what sake? So how do you see yourself oriented between wisdom traditions? And is that a fruitful space to be in?
I could talk long about that. Neither nor. In connection of this conversation, what I'm looking in all that is the oneness of all that, and in appreciation of the otherness. So not pretending like some kind of metaphysical thinking system. All these spiritual traditions, basically, they are basically about the same thing. Period. Yeah, Pyrrhonism, exactly. I just don't agree with that. The taste of Zen wisdom is very different than the taste that I find from the Desert Fathers. It's very different what I hear from the Shakti Shiva mysticism of Shaivism.
Can you briefly expand on the word taste? Because some people might take that as very subjective. Okay, this tastes like that to me, and to you it might taste differently.
In fact, I meant it in that undefined way, and I think for the sake of the conversation, it's maybe easier to leave it that. Because we all have, to some degree, relationships to different traditions, and even if we not have fully penetrated that in with our intellectual or spiritual understanding, we do have a taste of it. And Aurobindo, Sri Aurobindo, one of the sages of the 20th century, has a certain taste. And Krishnamurti has a different one. I brought it up several times. I'm very much interested, how can we, as a global society, create a togetherness that is related to the sacred, and that honors the difference of the different traditions, and at the same time allows oneself to be rooted in one particular one at the same time. So that's the question. And to looking into the oneness, that's not kind of mishing everything together and making some kind of obscure wholeness out of it. Being rooted in something, but appreciating the wholeness of the whole. That's where this interest comes from.
That's very interesting, and I think many people here would also have questions to what extent that is indeed possible between wisdom traditions, or that you necessarily have to be within one. But I think you're trying to combine, I think, those two notions a little bit, and I think that leads me to the other question: like, how would you respond to maybe criticism, or at least questions from people who are like, no, but we need to be embedded in one? And then maybe secondly also, okay, we have these wisdom traditions, but we also have, let's say, a more like the secular traditions in our society. Is that something to enter into dialogue with? And if so, how? Especially if you do say that many of the secular traditions have certain presuppositions, such as maybe a Cartesian rationalism, or is that something to be converted to at least a kind of, I should say it, inner space in between these wisdom traditions, as opposed to a secular position outside of it?
May I make a vacuum move?
You may.
You don't need to resolve it. You can hold it in a process perspective of a dialogical development of that. So that you don't need a final answer, but something is evolving in the engagement with the differences in that. And it also depends what you're talking about when you talk about the sacred. And I have, I guess, a particular understanding of it that I'm sure differs with the understanding of other people. And in that understanding, I make a certain claim that people find sometimes surprising. I'm saying the sacred is obvious.
Expand.
For everyone. I claim, and this is a very just purely phenomenological attempt, that everyone has a relationship to the sacred. Because if I say nothing is sacred to me, I have to have an understanding of this something that I don't have a relationship to. Otherwise, the sentence doesn't make sense. If I say nothing is sacred to me and I don't understand what sacred is, the sentence doesn't make any sense. That even if I say nothing is sacred to me, there is an understanding that makes it possible to say that sentence. So my claim is, even if you take this position, there is some resonance in yourself where this word, and you don't even need to define the word. It just can stay on an intuitive level. Shows up in you as a sacredness. Oh, this is very attractive somehow, or no, I hate it. But in which way ever, it's not hidden in that sense. I'm not saying that this is the depth of the sacredness. It just I say it's obvious, and this is a starting point to create a relationship with it in that. Right. And the charm of it is why I like this kind of approach to the sacred is that you don't need a metaphysical framework to define it. You start just with your experience of something that you use language to point to without necessarily. So it's very open, and many people can basically come from different point, and that's then also very much related to the openness of the open society, where someone like a Muslim can say this is sacred, and I, from whatever background I come, can this is sacred, and I completely don't understand or don't agree how he understands it. But at the same time, and that's very interesting, I can sense that we somehow seem to resonate to the same thing. Mm-hmm. In that doing, there's oneness with him. Even if we completely disagree with what the sacred is, mm-hmm. if there's a sense of we resonate to something that we together resonate in, mm-hmm. that is a oneness that allows us to live plurality of the open society in a different way, because then I can have respect for his understanding of the sacred, even if I define it or criticize it, and we can argue about it, but there's a foundation of oneness, and that's powerful, that's homing.
Well put. May I make a Pajovian move? I'm not sure if you're familiar with Jonathan Pajot. He's a good, he's a connection to this little corner of the internet. He is an individual in it, well connected also to John Vervaeke. And I would say that sometimes he is one of, let me put it differently, one of the recent discussions, let's say, that evolved over the last year is the question surrounding egregores, and then someone like John Vervaeke describes that as hyper objects. So this sense that maybe there are these collective agencies that we don't fully, there's no individual that has control over them, and nonetheless they seem to be evolving, nonetheless they seem to have a type of agency. And my question would be, and that's something that I think Pajot is particularly careful with, how do we know when this collective agency that is part of our oneness that we're engaging with is actually something that has, that for instance has our best interest at heart? So, or is it maybe something that is also working against us? So how do we know when this sacred that we're actually attaching ourselves to is something that is of divine goodness?
Yeah. So you're asking, I don't know if I find the right English words for it, what Ignatius of Loyola describes as the discern of the spirits. Mm-hmm. Basically, what is on the side of the good and what is on the side of the demonic. That's a very, very interesting question. And Pajot, his symbolic understanding, I learned a lot from him. I learned a lot. It expanded my understanding of science dramatically, and allowed me to appreciate things that I, at least in a rational way, could not appreciate before. In an existential way, I say I would, but there was a divide between my existential and my rational understanding. Like, let's talk about angels or demons. So just the fact that something like this exists, and guess, like many of us, we owe a lot to Henri Corbin and his definition between the imaginal and in imaginary, and John uses that also. That basically, we have to first accept that we always live already in a world of images that move us. And it's very interesting that maybe I have a Catholic background and there is an archetypal image like the Mother Mary, and it's culturally situated in a Christian Catholic background. But then you have different cultures with very different history, where you have someone like Shakti, and you see the differences of the cultural background, but you also see the archetypal parallels of that, and you see there is something in the imagery that is not just fantasy, but it's something that is real on a different level. Bouchot would say on a symbolic level. In that, I don't like the word symbolic because when you so much. Because immediately when you say symbolic, it sounds like it's not real, and that and it takes a time to use the word differently. But anyway,
Like with rationality, for
yeah,
instance.
exactly. Just to see that we all, and even the most rational person like Harris live in a mythological world. It's the myth of scientific rationalism that Harris kind of appreciates. But when you look, it's full of images and full of stuff. It's not just calculations. And to take this serious allows us to see that we are always influenced by that. And at least it starts to pose the question: is this something that is benevolent or not? And I think here it's at least where I would go to right now, is to kind of honor the work of the wisdom traditions, to create this discernment between one and the other, because in all of them, definitely in the Christian one, there is that things are not necessarily as they look like, and you need wisdom, cultivation of wisdom, to basically see that this one and the other. And I think that's part of spiritual maturation work, that you don't do on a weekend. That's things you do in a lifetime to refine, because to the degree you can, you also more and more free yourself out to rely on forces that are helpful, and avoid forces that are maybe only seemingly helpful. It's a little winded answer, but I hope it's
No.
okay.
I think it's very useful. So it's also when you enter into, I think, what you refer to as interbeing, right? This space. Does it occur to you, like those questions? What you said, like, is this benevolent or malevolent? Like, so, do you sometimes feel that there's a risk of simply the like, let's say the interbeing space that is created? Because I'm sure not every time you create this interbeing space, it's specifically tied to a wisdom tradition. But maybe I need to ask you a little bit more about that. But do you sometimes wonder if, for instance, accidentally or not so, you are participating in an interbeing space that is not necessarily benevolent, or is that not something you're concerned about? And if so,
No,
why not?
no, absolutely. Maybe let's not talk about the interbeing space first, but let's more start with we spaces. And we spaces can be all kind of things. And here you also can use the history of this land, Germany, to see that we can create a kind of a V space that can be very powerful and basically destroy the world. And it's all about coming together as one. In fact, one Reich, one Führer, one. It's this one, and it's this V space. There's something very dangerous, and how do you discern one from the other? Because there's also something which I interpret as a response to the disaster of fascism and Second World War. I interpret the postmodern response, the cynical response, the denying of any of that, as a kind of a soul response, and never again, Auschwitz. And there's some truth to that, but it created this postmodern, there's nothing but fractureness. Basically, there is no wholeness. There's not. Everything is just fractured, and we see basically after 70 years or whatever, 50 years of development of that, how maybe to some degree this was even a wholesome response to a degree, but you see the shadow side and the demonic side of this right now. So how do you discern between one and the other? The way I think about it and the way we work with that is two things. One, we use a language that kind of describes a difference, which we call pre-individuated V spaces and trans-individuated V spaces, which is interesting because the individuation process, where we become a personhood, is very much, in my understanding, even more so than in other traditions, a Christian process. Because very different to the South Asian emphasis, the pursuit of oneness in the Judeo-Christian and Islam context is a I-thou relationship, where what is cultivated not just by getting this, losing oneself in wholeness, which is one interpretation of Buddhism, not necessarily the only one. But you can see the difference of the path that Asia went there and what the Western traditions did. Versus the Hellenistic relationship of the different communities to the different gods, Athens, Athena, and Zeus, and all that. What developed is that every single individual, even slaves, women, have the capacity to develop a relationship to the absolute, to God. That's how my interpretation of that, and I would say there is even a radicalization of that in the Western process, which is Martin Luther. Basically, there's also no church; it's just me and the relationship, and me and the scripture. And that's my understanding of Luther. Excuse me.
We could talk about that more today.
So there's something very powerful what the West did, and it's very criticized because it's also ego development. And that's how basically Buddhist critique is: we have to overcome the ego. But there's a difference between a self sense and an ego sense. The difference is a ego sense is that basically everything is about me. It is self-centered. But being self-aware is the foundation of responsibility. There's something I understand. There's a relationship between the development of democracy in the West and the development of individuality in the West, because the democratic process is based on every single one of us has personhood, and has an individuated call for responsibility. So there's something very powerful. But as everything, it has its shadow side. And I think that these V spaces and what you do, I see is being part of it, is appreciating that this is not happening in isolated separation, but it is embeddedness, so that there's a V space that is trans-individuated, which means I need not less individuation for that, but more, because I have to hold the responsibility for our oneness. Sorry, it was long again.
No, that's great. That's great. It's very insightful. No, I know that Jonathan Rouse, and he says that we need a collective individuation right now, so that the individuation process needs to become to expand its scope in a certain way, and maybe that's also what you're alluding to. I want to bring it back to what's happening here at this festival, and maybe we can also expand that to this little corner overall, because not all individuals are present. So I'm curious to hear from you as a little bit more of an outsider than many of us are here. What do you see as the spirit that is happening here? What's the we space that is being created here? Can we articulate that well, and maybe can we also relate it to some of the tensions and themes that were brought up yesterday? For instance, also in the practice that we had together, where we saw some questions being brought up regarding, for instance, fluidity and stability of identity, but then also thinking about masculinity and femininity, the order and chaos, if we move back to Jordan Peterson lexicon. So I'm curious to hear, what is your perspective on what's happening here, and how do we properly respond to that and maybe give it a home, as you say?
I mean, the little I see, yeah. I would highlight two things that are standing out for me, and one is what I started this conversation with, which is spiritual homing. Yesterday, when I had this conversation with Matthias, I asked him also to let me see the guidelines of the estuary, and I read them, and in fact I forwarded them to my wife, and had a late night conversation with my wife about it. And she said, we should do something like that.
John van Donk will be pleased. The protocol is moving outward.
So I did not only sleep at night, because what you seem to do, to the degree, again, that I am able to grasp it as an outsider, you create a protocol where everyone, to say in simple, can bring one's own life in a meaningful exchange with the approach to just give it existential space to kind of dive into the meaning of that. So that's, I could say more about it, but that's one aspect. And the other that stands out for me is an interesting yes and no rootedness at the same time in a particular root of at least Christianity. Let's put it that way.
At least Christianity is.
What I mean, there's kind of things I don't really see through, from Calvinist to Orthodox. That's kind of puts the span of Christianity in its breadth, or kind of. So, but I see that, and I see the attempt, and I appreciate it very much, because what you seem to do here after 30 years of East meets West spirituality, which I think was also had also his healthy side. There's a refinding of our own roots to stand on our own legs in the Western tradition. I think John does something similar in a different way with his kind of Neoplatonist attempt. So it is something that I experience as a healing process of our Western identity in the dialogical process of world culture and finding a shared relationship in the open society of the world culture to be related to something that I would call the sacred.
Right. Thank you very much. No, we have about 20 minutes left, so I'm curious. Maybe maybe you have some themes or questions you want to bring in. Otherwise, I also would like to open it up to the audience. But maybe you have some input yourself that we haven't discussed yet that you would like to lay on the table, or that I can respond to, and otherwise the audience members.
Maybe in addition to that, just one thing before we open up. I talked yesterday also with someone about it after the noisy dinner conversation. Reflecting on how I understand what you're doing, I also reflected on the difference to what we, the Evolve, are doing, because our dialogical process, which is not the mandala process, that's just one piece of it, but it's a different emphasis, and I find what you are doing and achieving much more accessible to what IV attempt to do.
What kind of audience are you reaching? I'm curious. What demographic, what age demographic, and what kind of people respond to your?
Everyone from the elites.
That's very interesting. Let's expand on that. That's good.
No, that's kind of ironic, but a half true answer, and makes a point. The different, and that's related also to my thinking, just to explain how I see what you're doing and what I see what we are doing. And here the word interbeing field comes into perspective. That the easiest way to describe it, that our spiritual relationship to reality changed several times dramatically in human history. And one of the huge changes was, as I guess many of you know, Karl Jaspers coined the term the Axle Ages, where we had this transition from indigenous spirituality to the big traditions, from Taoism to Vedanta, to the Jewish prophets and the Greek philosophers. And what happened, it was only the starting point, but it was the starting point of what I said before, the individual relationship to the absolute. So something is not kind of we as a tribe relate to the gods, but I relate also in an ethical sense to something that I can call God or Brahman, or however I call it. So there's a very different relation. What happened is a spirituality of individuality and the absolute, but it also created separation, and it created the modern society. And what I see is that it seems with all these V-space practices that are emerging, my interpretation that the evolution of human culture is looking for a new form of integration, where we experience and practice our embeddedness and don't experience it just as separated, isolated individuals. But we have 2,000 years of basically practice to identify with separation.
So it's going to take some time. You're saying.
So, well, to basically experience a present situation, not just from a self-referent point of view, but basically looking through I speak metaphorically, looking through the eyes of the space itself. So to see this not only through the Thomas perspective, but our shared perspective. I mean, using this just to make a point, and how much this is metaphorical or not can be discussed, is a difficult attempt, but something very profound is possible, because to the degree that people are able to come together in that perspective, synergy is possible in a way that was not possible before. That all of a sudden things are able to synergize, and also multiplicity and difference can synergize in a very new way. And I find this a very powerful thing to happen, to be able to look at it. But that's basically where my heart is. That's where my work is, and it's not easily accessible.
Yeah, well, that's I just briefly, and then I think other people can tie into this. Is that there's also an ongoing discussion in this little corner, kind of between, let's say, John Vervaeke on the one hand, who is focusing on creating let's say, a spiritual Silk Road of Neoplatonism between traditions, which is far more philosophical and, if I dare say so, John, please forgive me, but is also a little bit elitist in the sense it does seem to attract less people who want the accessible format of something that is being offered in, for instance, estuary, but especially the church. And that's why John is in conversation with other individuals here who are focusing on the importance of narrative, on mythology, which John also finds threatening, or at least like he is very careful to go about that, and he thinks that when we enter into the ground of being, in some ways it's beyond narrative, it's beyond teleology, and he is afraid that also it's a story that will exclude other people. So while including, like you include people in your story, you also exclude, because from a Christian answer we'd say that that response to the separation between the individual and the absolute would be, we are all children of God, so we're brothers and sisters, and we're profoundly related to the absolute, but also separate from it. Just like you're separate from your parents, but you're not so separate from it that you don't have a part to play in the family. And at the same time, there's also a philosophical way of understanding this. And hopefully I think that's also what we're trying to do. We're trying to bridge those two understandings, that indeed, on the one hand, it is still not entirely separate from this more narrative understanding of the individual in its relation to the absolute, but that also it can serve as a bridge between wisdom traditions and maybe even into the secular society. And I don't want to have the last word, so please take the last word, and then after that we can maybe just have some audience questions.
One short response. First, I very much agree with you. I have my different forms of personal spiritual practice, and one that I'm doing right now. Every morning, I listen to one of the German sermons of Meister Eckhart, and I find it fascinating when you listen to Meister Eckhart, how he combines what you're saying, because it's all about the Bible and the story, but basically when you listen, you hear all the time Plotinus, but he's always bringing it in the stories of the 13th century Germany culture. So I think you can do both, and we also have to find ways to do both.
And you even argue that someone like Martin Heidegger stays throughout his project and profoundly
my argument
influenced.
is that you don't understand Heidegger if you don't understand that his whole life basically comes from Meister Eckhart. Even his famous difference between sign, being and beings, I would claim comes from Eckhart's differentiation between God and God behind God.
Okay, I always thought that was from Thomas Aquinas, but that's very interesting. Okay,
that's Eckhart.
Okay, very good. Okay, then does anyone have a question? Okay, I see a bunch of questions, so you can lead. And it can also relate to other parts of the conference, but specifically to the conversation would be preferable.
Yeah, I have a problem with the term individual because
Yes. Brief questions.
So,
No
yeah.
statements. Questions.
so the way I look at individual is like it's this an separate point of authority, right? Like there's an individual authority with in the individual, and so when you're talking about how the individual is in the collective, right? I'm having a hard time to wrap my mind around it, right? Because if you would use the word personal, right, and I have to have a personal relationship to the collective, I I I can get along with that. But when you say individual, like, how does something that's divided, right? Like it's defined by its separateness, by its uniqueness, uh, connect to the group. Like, can you make that connection for me?
I think it's a misunderstanding because there's nothing like collective individualism, but there's something where we can appreciate, and you can use, I would say, the word my personality, my individual responsibility, which is important. That I'm not just part of a tribe, but I, Thomas, respond to you right now, and there's nobody to blame but me, what I do. So in that, I have to have these words, and you can use different, an individual understanding of myself. This is not my family, my tribe. This is me who is responsible for the way how I respond. This, and I think that's a dignity of modernity, that there's no excuse, and I think we got it from Christianity. This kind of personal responsibility, in that allows me to take part, in that I feel not only responsible for me in the situation, but I'm aware of a wholeness, and I also want to respond to the wholeness that I'm aware of. That's what I mean. But you're completely right. There is no collective individuality. There's a contradiction itself.
So I have a question to you, Thomas, as well. You said that one cannot make the argument that nothing is sacred to oneself because it kind of presupposes the definition of sacred. And at least to me, this seems to water down the definition of sacred. So I'd like to ask what, if any, difference there is between sacred and very important, and how you would kind of actually put your finger on the definition of sacred.
First, you're 100% right. It does water it down. Because I see it's just an access point where something can open up, but it hasn't opened up yet. It's just I just want to remove the denial of the relationship, but it's not the depth of it. I forgot your question.
How to distinguish very important
Exactly.
from sacred.
In a simplified way, and that's just very symbolically spoken. If something is so important that it brings me to my knees, I find the word sacred appropriate. I know that's not a real definition, but an extensional way for me if I say something is very important, I have a certain it's something that really brings me to my knees because I experience it. I could say this is sacred to me. That's.
Yes, thank you. Another question for Thomas. So the way I see it, you're proposing that it would be good for us to sort of come together and be able to share in meaning, and that we can do that by adopting, as you said, the perspective of the space itself, of the dialogue. And sort of the problem, no, not the problem I see, is that if this is the goal, to create this shared space.
We space, yeah.
Yeah, the we space. I do see an example of it in the world right now, which is free trade. That people can trade freely, and everyone has their own economic interests, and through free trade, we can kind of accomplish this? Like I can see it happening. Do you think that is good? And should we expand markets to accomplish this?
Keep in mind that Thomas also has a Marxist background, so
I think it's the opposite of it, and that's not an argument against free trade. I think in limits, free trade is a powerful way how to regulate things. But you described it yourself. Free trade happens. Basically, I'm aware of my interests. You're aware of your interests, and then let's negotiate. And let's go. But the perspective of it is always on the individual, and then we negotiate between individuals. So not by chance the free trade economy is very much based on individualism. There's a lot of reasons to find ways to have that this is part of how we do it. But is there a way, and the climate crisis is a good chance to think about it, where we have to think about our shared interests together, and not my and your interest in that, where wholeness becomes part of my attention, and not my, basically, I'm for climate change because I wanna don't like that Germany gets so hot in the summer. Just a little stupid, but you get my point.
Self-interested reasons. No, and I would also say that, John Verweke recently had a conversation with D.C. Schindler about the Hegelian notion of freedom, and in some sense it is profoundly related to the understanding of freedom that has come about in Christianity, which is like you're not free to have like this, let's say, like to pick and choose from certain things or from products in the market, but you're also free if you're actually no longer bounded by more arbitrary desires in some ways. And that's why the individual freedom is actually when you're fully submitting yourself to God in the Christian understanding, and which is also, I think, that also comes about on a collective level in the Exodus lectures. Like you're not just free when you escaped from the Pharaoh, from Egypt, like then you're in the desert. Then you still need to find your freedom by submitting yourself to a new type of order, and one that will actually have your best interest at heart. So I think also like we need to find the balance between our understanding of freedom and that maybe that positive sense of freedom, combining that with the negative sense of freedom, will allow for a more generative we space. And I see more questions coming up, so we can. I think the mic is yes.
Thank you, and I think freedom is a very important topic. But in the Exodus story, there's also the sacred. The whole Exodus story is, of course, how to bring the sacred from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land. And the sacred in the Exodus story is also a little bit dangerous. So I was wondering, Thomas, if we just not only take the awe aspect, I fall on my knees, so important is it. Is sacred just nice and good and fuzzy, or is it also a bit more demanding of us? I just wonder what your thoughts are.
Is bringing you to your knees nice and good and fuzzy? I'm just curious, but maybe that's
yeah. No, but you're highlighting an important aspect, and I guess you know Rudolf Otto's work on the sacred. He wrote in the beginning of the 20th century a German phenomenological, semi-phenomenological philosopher about the sacred, and he makes the whole point that the sacred is on one hand ecstatic, but on the other it's also horrible. And I guess you also maybe know Rilke's definition that the beauty is basically always on the verge of killing you to really appreciate. That's a different. I'm talking switching beauty, but it's very, very related. That's a different kind of beauty than something that's nice and slick.
That's also in Plotinus, by the way. Yeah. That's the same notion of beauty as something that is profoundly shocking and dangerous, as opposed to, indeed, and this is he's a Korean German philosopher, but Byung-Chul Han, like he has also spoken about beauty, that it has become sort of the smooth, as opposed to indeed like that which profoundly shocks us at the core of our being. So I think that's also related to it. There's a follow-up.
Yeah, just to follow up then. In the Exodus story, therefore, the sacred needs to be housed. It's not just us who need to be housed, also the sacred needs to be housed. We've got the tabernacle for that, and it's quite a you have to be careful around that thing. How do you see us housing the sacred in this space?
That's very. I don't really have an answer, but I'm very interested in the question. One thing that immediately comes to mind, that the word sacred means also this kind of separation. So even in the Latin language, what you're posing is very much that there's the differentiation between the sacred space and the mundane space, I could say a lot about my thoughts why it could be helpful to make this separation, but I don't have a definite answer to what you're saying. Yeah.
We have time for one more question, so if someone has something quick.
Thomas, for opening up, and yeah, I appreciate it. And also your demeanor, how you're doing this. I want to go back to the egregores, and I see a risk of us creating and feeding them in our joint quest and trying to find groups and interact and make these spaces for opening up. And you mentioned some points about submission to a wisdom tradition, and as checkpoints or ways to safeguard us from developing these and worshiping these angels or demons. I was wondering if you could expand on that a little bit and how that would look like in practice. Yeah.
I mean, two answers come to my mind. One is more oriented towards you, and my take is you're doing that. So you're finding a tradition, and you are submitting. And there is a danger in doing that, because the downside is one can be narrow-minded in doing this. But out of the very reason that you were mentioning, I think this is a powerful thing to do. And the other answer is about myself, which is interesting, because it's a pain point of mine, because of what my heart is beating for, basically kind of opening up the sacred for the open society. The way I interpret it forces me to place myself in the middle. And then I'm, at the same time, feel a little dehomed, because either you could become megalomaniac or you become dehomed. These two choices you have there. And the way I respond, and I haven't resolved it, is to also honor that the way I put it, and please forgive me, that I define myself as not only Christian, honoring the ground I stand on, but honoring also the openness I want to move in. That's as far as I got with this. But it's a really thing where it occupies me, because I don't feel I have the final answer to that.
Well, thank you so much. Let's